This is the Candid podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. Okay, boys and girls, you're in your 20s now, so I think it's about time to settle in and have that conversation about the birds and the bees. See, when a man likes a woman, he gets this indescribable drive all throughout his entire body that essentially makes him lose all control of his rational thinking. And the only thing on this man's mind is, I'm just messing around, y'all. We're not going to be having that kind of talk today. But I bet some of you women out there were listening along and were about to finish my sentence and say, it makes him act like a no good, dirty, low down, sex craved horn dog. And while in many cases you're not entirely wrong, that's really not the topic of this podcast. If mom and dad didn't school you already on how that whole thing works, then you're going to have to go pick up a few books or check out a few other YouTube channels that specialize in that kind of content so you can brush up on what you missed out on in your Sex Ed 101 class. With that being said, we're still going to discuss the topic of sex, just in a different context. What I'm looking to make extremely clear to both men and women with this podcast is the differences between sex talk and XPECTATIONs. I've seen far too many people get this concept confused, and it oftentimes ends up not only leading to a huge waste of time for both parties, but also some fairly devastating consequences if people don't get out in front of discussing sexual expectations early on in the dating process. For whatever reason, people have no issues talking about jobs, finances, cars, retirement plans, what city you want to live in, whether red or blue is the better color, and everything else in between during the dating stage. But they always seem to put off or avoid talking about one of the major things that usually doesn't change that much in a relationship. And that's what each person is or is not willing to do in the bedroom. I can hear all the ladies booing me right now and throwing rotten fruit at their computer monitors or phones. But I'm sorry, ladies. Even though sex does make up just a small percentage of your relationship, it's still a part of your relationship, and you need to ensure that both parties are on the same page and know exactly what to expect of their partner when it comes time to get down with the get down. But never fear, that's exactly what you have me for. I'll talk about the numerous reasons why having conversations around XPECTATIONs is so important, and I'll also give you some real-world examples to back up exactly why I feel the way I do on this subject. I'm going to start out with clearly defining the difference between sex talk and discussing XPECTATIONs. From my perspective, this one is pretty cut and dry. And ladies, I actually have your back on this one. So put your rotten vegetables down and just keep listening for a bit. You may still end up disagreeing with me a bit later, but at least on this subject, I'm on your side. Simply put, sex talk is something that should only happen once you've established a relationship and both parties are okay with it. Sex talk is never something that should be happening when you just meet someone and you're chatting, getting to know each other, and debating whether or not to go on a date. A great example of sex talk is a man saying something like, "You have some nice full lips and they look good for kissing, but I'm wondering what else you'd be willing to do with them lips." Or a man saying something like, "If you were over my house right now and I tripped, fell, and accidentally ripped your shirt off while I was trying to brace my fall, and my face ended up in your well-endowed, supple bosom, what would you do? Then there's everyone's favorite locker room style sex talk, where a woman may say something like, when she goes swimming, she enjoys going off into the deep end of the pool. And the man responds with something sophomoric like, oh, so you like it deep, huh? Those kinds of statements are great examples of dirty/sexual talk. And I have absolutely zero issue with a woman shutting that mess down ASAP and not entertaining that kind of BS from a man she just met and is interested in getting to know for a potential long-term relationship. It's pretty obvious from those kinds of scenarios that the man only has one thing on his mind, and it's not getting to know you for the purpose of a relationship. He's trying to see if you're a freak and willing to give him some of the good stuff right away. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're a woman on a hookup app and this is the kind of thing that you're looking for, then you do you. I'm not here to tell you how to go about your dating and sex life. But if you're dating with intention and not looking for a quick roll in the hay, as the old timers used to say, and that is still not to be confused with Alzheimer's, then I'm completely on your side if you find this kind of talk disgusting and offensive, and you ultimately decide to cease any and all conversations with a man coming at you this way. No pun intended there either. And to all the men out there, sorry, but I'm with the ladies on this one. Stop leading with your little 2-inch killers and getting all down and dirty with the sex talk 3 days after meeting or matching with a woman. If you claim to be looking for a real relationship, then leading off conversations with these sexually charged scenarios and statements is not the way to go about it. Put your Johnson back in your pants and start thinking with the head on the top of your body instead. There's a better way to find out if you and a potential partner are compatible sexually than leading out the conversation like the beginning of a 90s porno flick or an episode of Benny Hill. If you know, you know. Now that I've given a pretty clear definition of what I feel is considered sex talk, let's talk about the difference between that and discussing XPECTATIONS. Now it's my time to apologize to the women. So sorry, ladies, but talking XPECTATIONS is something that is important, even early on in the dating phase. And I'll explain why very briefly. First, I want to define what exactly discussing XPECTATIONS is. Again, simply put, talking about XPECTATIONS is two mature adults having a PG conversation around what each person's sexual expectations are for the relationship. A very simple and easy way to go about a conversation like this would be to use the political party system. When it comes to sex, are you conservative, moderate, or liberal? Of course, you're always more than welcome to start off by getting into specifics, but the political party language at least gives you both some kind of baseline to lead the conversation off in a mature, respectful manner and without having dirty sexual talk or innuendo involved. Say, for example, that your partner says they're moderate sexually. You can then ask, well, what does that mean to you? Does that include oral, the butt? What kinds of frequency are you looking for, etc., etc.? What would you consider as going too far outside of the moderate spectrum? And yes, I get it. You're still talking about sex, but it's not some kind of raunchy, I'm horny in the moment kind of talk where your only thought is talking as nasty as possible. You're legitimately trying to discuss what each party's sexual expectations are and see if they're in alignment or not. And I see nothing wrong with that as long as both parties can keep things respectful and as PG as possible. And yes, this goes for Christians as well. And I know some of you people out there are going to vehemently disagree with that, but oh well, I said what I said. Just because someone is a Christian, that doesn't mean they're not an adult with certain wants, needs, and desires in certain areas. And sex is one of those areas. I know there's a lot of debate in the Christian community around what should and should not be done in the bed. But I stand by the fact that as long as it's between a married man and woman and no other people, children, or animals are involved, and yes, I have to say this because yes, it was in the Bible too, then no one has any right to tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing in the bedroom with your husband or wife. I'm going to touch on this later as well, but there are Christians who have been burned by not having the XPECTATIONS taught because they kept kicking that can down the road when they shouldn't have. Bottom line is that as long as you can clearly separate sex talk from XPECTATIONS, there's absolutely no benefit to waiting on discussing this subject because it's just too important. And the end result from delaying this conversation is rarely ever a good one. I want to move on and take a good amount of time explaining, particularly to the women out there, why sex and discussing the sexual expectations for a relationship is so important, especially for us men. The first reason that I can give is simply because it just is. Sex is important to us men. I know a good number of women out there place it lower on the totem pole than us men do, but men are not women. We're men, and we're just wired differently. I'm not at all saying that you can't blame us men for cheating or our sexual desires getting us into trouble, because that's never an excuse for that kind of behavior, ever. But you just can't blame us men for being biologically wired to desire sex on a regular basis and for feeling it's a more important part of a relationship to us than it is to you. The exact same way men will never understand what women go through when they're pregnant, how their bodies, hormones, and emotions are constantly changing, is the exact same way that women will never understand how men frequently walk around with sexual urges and how it sometimes literally feels like we can't control ourselves. That's just how we're built. You got a problem with that? Talk to the man upstairs, not us. Once that testosterone gets flowing and them sexual juices get to raging in a man, it can oftentimes feel so overpowering that a man will do things with a woman he's nowhere near attracted to in that moment. And as soon as he finishes, he's looking at that woman with regret and wondering what the hell did he just do with her? Again, I'm not saying it's right or excusing men for using a woman for sex at all. I'm just trying to paint a picture of how overpowering sexual urges can be for us men and why it's something that's so important to us, even though it is a much smaller part of a relationship. Women usually feel more connected to a man on an emotional level, like when they're out holding hands and shopping, while men usually feel more connected to women on a physical level, like when they're in the bed together doing the deed. That's why you'll often hear a man tell a woman he loves her or saying things he doesn't always mean during the act. Again, not making excuses, just giving facts here. So now that most women out there have a better idea of why sex means more to us men than it does to women, you also have more of an understanding on why discussing XPECTATIONS is so important early on in the dating process. Women place more of an emphasis on things like money, which most men don't think is as important because financial situations can always change. But that doesn't stop women from wanting to know where a man stands financially as part of the dating process. Even though women feel like XPECTATIONS is a low priority on the dating list, now you know why it's so important for us men. And if you couple that with the fact that what someone is and isn't willing to do in bed often doesn't change very much, any man seeking a new partner would be a fool not to discuss sexual compatibility before moving forward and trying to establish a long-term relationship. And for those of you out there who still don't want to jump on board with my thinking, I'm about to give you numerous legitimate reasons why discussing sexual expectations is beneficial for both parties. I'll start off with building trust and emotional intimacy as the first benefit. Openly sharing desires, boundaries, and preferences can create a space where both parties feel safe, seen, and understood. Simply put, being able to talk to a potential partner about what you both expect in the bedroom will allow you to, hopefully, be completely open and honest with each other and alleviate the stigma of talking about sex that so many people seem to have. This, in turn, will hopefully build more trust between you and your partner and increase the emotional intimacy between you. It will allow you to focus on the things that you can do in the bedroom instead of wondering, questioning, and possibly overstepping a boundary in the middle of doing the deed, which could potentially ruin the entire mood and cut off the sex completely right at that moment. There are plenty of times where someone may try something and then feel judged or ashamed because their partner rejects them in the moment. But this is a great opportunity for you to communicate beforehand and explain to your partner why you don't think that doing X is a bad thing. There's way too many reasons for me to list out here, but you get my general point. Even if you have these discussions and find out that you're both not on the same page, discussing what's expected from each other in the bedroom beforehand is the respectful thing to do, because it shows that at least you thought enough of the other person to talk to them about their desires first, instead of lying to them or ignoring some potential sexual red flags that you saw just because you want a relationship so badly. Even though this relationship didn't blossom into something more because you just weren't compatible in the sack with your potential partner, you're still building up some internal street cred and trust that you can carry with you. And the person that you finally end up settling down with is going to appreciate you that much more because of it. I'll move on to my next point. And this one is a pretty big one that I'm going to give an expanded example of later on, which is preventing misunderstandings and resentment. Assumptions or unmet expectations almost always lead to frustration. Being honest early and often helps avoid miscommunication and reduces the chance of one partner feeling neglected, pressured, or dissatisfied. Now, there are a couple of key words here that were used. The first one being assumptions. Now, you know what they always say about what happens when you assume. You make an ass out of you and me. Assumptions when it comes to dating are a very dangerous thing. For example, some men meet a woman who they may assume is into certain things sexually because of the way she walks, talks, dresses, etc., only to find out that woman is extremely conservative when it comes time for intimacy. Again, I'm not saying that men should get with a woman only because she's into what he's into sexually, but dating a woman you're not sexually compatible with isn't a smart idea either. Trust me, I've had many of conversations about this subject with women, and your mind can sometimes lean in one direction with what it's thinking, only for you to have an actual conversation around this subject and end up being shocked at the woman's answers. That's why it's always best to get the answers directly instead of assuming you already know them. The other key word here to me is resentment. I don't care how much you claim to love a woman or want to love a woman. If you commit to her long term, get married, start doing the deed, and then find out she's not willing to do most of the things you're into sexually, you will most likely start to resent her. Even though it's not her fault for not desiring the same things as you sexually, it's only natural for a human being to start feeling rejected when their partner keeps constantly telling them no to almost everything they want to do in the bedroom. And that's a very difficult thing to overcome. It's pretty easy for the man in this example to get upset because he feels like he's paying all the bills, treating this woman like a queen, staying faithful, grinding for the family, yet he can't even get X, Y, or Z from this woman in the bedroom. As a man, I can absolutely understand that feeling. But at the same time, sex is a very personal thing, and it's supposed to be fun for both parties. So expecting someone to do things in the bedroom they're not comfortable with isn't the right move either. Neither the man nor the woman is wrong for how they feel in this situation, but had they have talked about sexual expectations before making it this far down the road in their relationship, they could have avoided this entire situation altogether. But unfortunately, now they're married, and the man in this situation is most likely going to be stuck feeling unfulfilled in a very key area that's probably never going to change. Up next, we have improving sexual satisfaction, which is also a very major point as well. Talking about what you do or don't enjoy is going to naturally lead to better experiences in the bedroom, and you're far more likely to meet each other's needs when you're both on the same page sexually. Obviously, this one seems like a no-brainer, but to some people, it's not. I say that because there are some people out there, again, particularly some Christians, who act as if sex between a man and a woman is some kind of duty or business arrangement that's only meant to be had when you're trying to have children or to consummate a marriage in order to make it official. And while those scenarios are definitely valid and true, that doesn't mean that you have to treat sex like some kind of special occasion. Sex is supposed to be fun and enjoyable, again, for both parties. So no one wants to end up stuck in a situation where fun time comes around and it feels like a struggle to get on the same page, and one person ends up leaving the encounter unsatisfied because their partner is not willing to do the things that they like, or if their partner is trying to convince them to do things that they don't want to do. It just ruins the satisfaction all the way around. And that can oftentimes make someone flat out stop seeking sexual contact with their partner altogether. As I said a minute ago, I know that some, but not all, Christians shy away from the XPECTATIONS talk during the dating phase for fear of it possibly going down the wrong path, or because they may view sexual satisfaction as not being a priority. But I personally just believe this is a mistake. We're all unique people, whether you're Christian or not, and we all have different wants and needs, including in the bedroom. No smart person would marry a partner who doesn't satisfy their needs in other areas of the relationship. For example, if you dated someone who only likes cooking a certain type of food that doesn't agree with you, and they refuse to cook anything different, you'd be a fool to not discuss that issue before getting married to that person. Something would be seriously wrong with you if you ignored that potential red flag, got married anyway, and just ate food that doesn't agree with you every single day. Well, sex is no different. And I do understand that many people try to hold off on sex before marriage, and that's fine. Still, a wise person is going to do as much research as possible through proper communication to ensure that when it comes time to hop in the old sack with their partner, that both parties are having sex that's enjoyable and satisfying, because that's one of the biggest factors to keeping your sex life healthy and consistent. As soon as one party starts seeing sex as more of a duty or loses interest in it because they're not satisfied, then you're headed for a world of problems that you don't want in this area. This next point is a really great one too, which is talking sexpectations addresses values and compatibility. Sexual expectations often tie into deeper values such as frequency, monogamy, spontaneity, or the role of sex in your overall relationship. These discussions can often reveal if your long-term desires even align or not. And the first thing that pops into my mind when I hear this one is facts. Now, I won't touch on the monogamy part as much because that's honestly something that most people do discuss pretty early on when meeting someone. I've talked to more than a few women who were very honest up front that they were poly or were seeking a polyamorous relationship. And of course, that's not for me. So I thank them for their honesty and we went our separate ways. But if we look at some of the other points, they can oftentimes be a major roadblock that appears in relationships where sexpectations were not discussed beforehand. Frequency is a big one, and it's one that I'm going to touch on in one of my personal examples later on. But making sure you're compatible with your partner when it comes to how often you're going to be doing the deed every month is critical. And I will say this is very much something I gear more towards men than I do women, because the fact of the matter is that most times it's the man in a relationship that's looking to be more sexually active with the woman than the reverse. And of course, no, this isn't a one-size-fits-all situation where you agree to do the deed 4 times a week no matter what. There will always be days when one person wants it and the other person doesn't. And there will be weeks where the action is heavier and weeks where the action is lighter. But that still should not stop you from coming up with a baseline average of X many days a week where you're looking to have some intimacy. The other point that's extremely important here to discuss is spontaneity, because that's yet another issue I've heard men in particular complain about as being a roadblock for sex in their relationships. I'm just being honest here, ladies. When most men get that urge to get things on and popping with you, they're kind of looking to set things off right then and there. Now, obviously, there are situations where this can't apply, like public places and areas where there's a lot of people. Then again, some of you sick freaks out there won't let that stop you either. But seriously, though, I'm talking within reason. It could be in the kitchen of your house or in the basement while you're cleaning. I don't know, but you get my point. If the man gets that urge to have some relations with his woman right then and there, even if it's not necessarily an ideal situation, then he's ready to go. And the last thing he wants is to be rejected or treated like he's nasty because you're not both in the proper setting of being in your bedroom at night with all the lights turned off and candles lit. And before all the women get mad at me, I'm not saying that you always have to give it to your man in these situations. And I do understand that sometimes you may be sweating or just not feeling quite ready for prime time in your private regions at that moment. I'm just making the point that if you're the kind of woman who is just not into spontaneous sex at all, but your man is, that's going to be an issue. One thing that I've heard many of men say is that they hate, quote, appointment sex, where they feel like they always have to schedule relations with their wife at a certain time and place because it absolutely kills the spontaneous and adventurous part of the entire act. As I've said numerous times, sex is supposed to be fun. And what's the fun in constantly having sex in the same place at the same time and in the same way? If you and your partner happen to rub up against each other in the pantry and them feelings start rushing through you, you can send them kids to their rooms while you have yourselves a bit of fun enjoying each other for a good 30 seconds. Again, I'm kind of messing around here, but also kind of not. Again, you get my point though. These kinds of examples play a key role in shaping you and your partner's sexual compatibility, and they also define the role of sex in your relationship. If one person sees sex as a major part of the marriage that should be had on site whenever the mood arises, but another person views it as less important and something that needs to be more planned, structured, and less frequent, then just like the previous example I gave, you're headed down a road that's not going to end well for you if you don't discuss these things before you even consider moving forward with a relationship. The last example I'll give here is that discussing sex expectations early can assist you with evaluating whether there's potential for room and growth, and can help you decide if the person you're looking to date could eventually become what you're looking for sexually in a partner or not. Sometimes when discussing sex expectations with a partner, the answers may not always be strictly black and white. So that's why having a healthy conversation can create an opportunity to discuss certain wants and needs to see if your potential partner is even open to exploring those things. For example, maybe your partner is conservative sexually right now because they just haven't done very much or been introduced to different things. But they may be willing and open to trying more things, but can't give you a full guarantee that they're going to like and commit to doing all of those things long term. That's completely fair. It may not be the answer the other person wants to hear, but at least it's an honest answer, which is all that you can ask for. Now it's up to you to evaluate that answer and decide whether or not it's worth moving forward with a relationship given where this person is sexually. If you feel this person may be willing to open up and try new things and that they're worth putting in the effort to explore with, then great. If you feel this person may just be too hesitant to open up and commit to what you're looking for in a sexual partner, then that's fine as well. Maybe you two just aren't meant for each other. And let me clarify my words for some people out there so that none of you get it twisted. I am not suggesting that you just dump a person simply because you didn't initially get the answer that you were looking for during your sexpectations talk. I made it clear that it's up to each individual to evaluate their sexual wants and needs against the other person's answer and overall attitude towards the subject, and then make a decision based on that. I am not trying to steer anyone in any particular direction. You have to do what's best for you at the end of the day. I'm just trying to give you all the tools to help you make a smart decision and avoid making a costly mistake that will come back to bite you in the booty later on down the road. You can apply this entire subject to any other area of a relationship, such as having kids, what city and state you want to live in, whether you're looking for a homebody or someone who likes to travel, and the list goes on and on. Sacrificing something that's very important to you just to be in a relationship with someone else is never a good idea. But for whatever reason, sex seems to be the one area where people are expected to do just that. That makes zero sense to me, and I'm putting it into that mindset right now. Now that I have you all buttered up with my numerous examples of why discussing sexpectations pre-relationship is so important, I'm going to give you two real-world examples that back up my points. I have one example of where failing to discuss sexpectations ended up terribly, and one example of where it worked exactly as expected. So I'll go ahead and start with the failed example first, and leave the good example for last so that we can end this podcast on a positive note. So I know a person who I'll call Dan. And yes, I promise, Dan is not me. You'll hear about me in the next example. Anyway, Dan is an extremely Christian man who religiously goes to church and is one of the most upstanding men you'll probably ever meet in life. Dan is in his late 40s, has never been married, and he's looking to get married and have at least one kid very much sooner rather than later, which makes complete sense. Dan also tends to prefer interracial relationships, which no matter what your skin color is going to make finding a woman that much harder. Anyway, Dan finally met a woman in his church. They initially hit it off, and they began dating for a long time before eventually getting engaged almost 2 years later. As with pretty much every Christian church member, they started going to pre-marriage counseling with their pastor shortly after announcing their engagement. And I'll give you my thoughts on this part shortly. During said marriage counseling, they discussed multiple things that they had already discussed, like kids, finance, living location, them remaining at the same church after marriage, and a host of other things. And while they may have had some minor disagreements in an area or two, once the discussion turned to the old S word, the whole conversation went south. I'll give the pastor credit for one thing here, and that he's the one who actually started the conversation around sex and sexual expectations. So he earns an A+ on that end. Anyway, after Dan and his fiancée discussed and listed out their sexual expectations, it was clear that they were not on the same page. Dan was looking to experience and do some things sexually that his fiancée was vehemently against. In Dan's mind, these were things that they'd both be doing to each other, and he was very willing to give just as much as he received. But again, his fiancée was completely against it, and I'm sure it's not too hard to figure out what I'm talking about here. Anyway, Dan got upset, and this sparked a pretty big argument between them, to which the pastor ended up taking the woman's side. And here's where the pastor earned an F-, and it's one of the reasons why I am not a fan of counseling with pastors anymore when relationship issues arise. And yes, on this one, I'm speaking from experience as well. Pastors always seem to side more with the women than they do with the man, no matter what the circumstances are. You could legitimately say that your old lady tried to eliminate you, and the pastor would be like, maybe she was just trying to get your attention because you've been sleepwalking through life and you were already essentially dead. But pastor, I may have been the walking dead, if that's what you want to call it, but I wasn't actually like dead. O ye of little faith, did Jesus not rise Lazarus from the grave? I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. That may be a bit extreme, but that's how my experience with pastors and counseling has always gone. Back to the story about Dan. I do want to make it very clear that I'm not saying the pastor should have sided with Dan over his fiancée. To me, this was a situation where neither person was wrong for how they felt, but the pastor laid into Dan pretty well for simply liking what he likes, which I think is ridiculous. Either way, this entire XPECTATIONS exchange between Dan and his fiancée literally, yes, literally, ended in them breaking up and never getting back together again. Yep, almost 2 years of Dan's life went up in flames because him and his fiancée didn't find out until deep into their relationship that they weren't sexually compatible. I mean, yes, to be fair, there was another minor issue or two that also played a part in the breakup, but the major factor here was the sexual incompatibility and neither side being willing to adjust their preferences. All the dates they went on, time spent together, and money spent on each other, gone. Just like that. I know it sounds crazy, and I'm sure there are some people who are going to blame one side over the other, but I'm not really looking to get into all that. At the end of the day, I'm just using this as a major cautionary tale of what can happen when you keep kicking the XPECTATIONS can down the road. It could eventually come back to haunt you, and the consequences will be very severe on many different levels. So as I promised, I'm going to move towards ending this podcast on a positive note, using none other than yours truly as an example. I've been very open about my extended time on dating apps years ago, so this story comes from back in my swiping days. I had matched with a woman on Plenty of Fish, who I was very attracted to based on her pictures. She had long, dark hair, beautiful eyes, she had a great figure, and was just generally my type physically. Of course, looks are never enough to base a relationship off of, so I was definitely excited to see if we aligned in other areas as well. We started messaging back and forth consistently for a few days, and being completely honest, I was starting to think she may have been the one. She seemed to have a great personality. She didn't want any more kids. She was funny. Her replies were long and thoughtful. She was looking for a man to lead. She had a great career, and she was even into a very uncommon hobby of mine, just as much as I was into it. All signs were pointing towards wifing her up ASAP. Okay, I might be going a bit too far there, but she really seemed like a genuine, authentic person, which is something extremely hard to find these days. Since things were going so well between us, I decided to find a creative way to interject a bit of XPECTATIONS talk into the conversation, which in hindsight was a very smart thing to do. Now, I can't fully remember how I did it, but I mentioned that I'd want to be chasing my woman or wife around the house a lot, and that I was definitely all about having relations at least a few times a week. Not an hour, not a day, but a week. And that's when the conversation turned. She mentioned that sex was not at all even remotely important to her, and that at this stage of life, she's seeking a relationship based much more on emotions than sex. I mean, she basically stopped just short of saying she could care less if she ever had sex again in her life. She mentioned how her and her ex-husband had issues in this area, with him always wanting sex, her being completely uninterested, and her feeling like she was essentially pressured into having sex. And she stated that she'd never want to feel like that ever again. Whew. Boy, am I glad that I brought this subject up, because that's exactly the opposite of what I wanted to hear. I politely responded to her that I absolutely respected her feelings on the matter, but that unfortunately, we just didn't align in that area. I told her that sex in a relationship was very important to me, but that I completely respected her perspective. I told her that she was a beautiful person that seemed like the right catch for the right man, but that I just probably wasn't that man. I wished her well, and we both went our separate ways. I didn't call her frigid or throw insults or any of that kind of mess at her, and I legitimately wasn't mad at her for feeling the way she did. It's her life, and she's entitled to be whatever way works best for her, not me. Either way, the point of this story couldn't be any more clear. I saved us both potentially weeks, months, or maybe even more than that of trying to date someone who we would have ended up being totally incompatible with sexually. And I did that by addressing the sexpectations subject early on in the talking/dating phase, rather than putting it off until later. I'll end this podcast with this. Look, folks, at the end of the day, I realize that not everyone is going to agree with me on this subject, but I feel like I've given you more than enough evidence to justify my case here. Just as easily as someone can say, if you really love someone, then sexual expectations shouldn't matter. I can counter that with, well, if you really love someone, then you should be willing to meet your partner's sexual expectations as long as they're not extreme or illegal. But a mature person knows that reality just doesn't work that way. As I've said many of times in other podcasts, as far as we know, we only get one time around this spinning sphere we call Earth. And there are certain wants, needs, and things people want to experience while they're here. And fun, exciting sex is one of those things. Yes, I do understand that sex is not the only part of a relationship, and that for some, sex eventually fades. But while it's here and you can still have it, some of us want it to be as enjoyable as possible. And that means finding a partner that meets our sexual expectations and vice versa. If you had two cars in front of you and you were given the choice to spend the same amount of money on one of those cars, but one has a cloth interior and a factory sound system versus the other one, which had the leather interior and Bose sound system you've always wanted, you'd be a fool to buy either one of those cars without at least opening the doors first and checking the inside to see which one had the features you were looking for. Sure, a car is a car. They're both going to get old, weathered, damaged, and they're both going to get you from A to B just the same. But the fact of the matter is that you're going to get much more enjoyment and pleasure out of driving one car over the other because it has more of the features that you're looking for. And yes, I'm aware that relationships are much more nuanced than making a car purchase, but the point remains the same. If certain sexual requirements are important to you, then you need to ask the proper questions early on in the dating phase to ensure that both you and your partner don't get stuck dumping a ton of time, energy, and resources into a relationship that turns out to be a lemon in the bedroom later on down the road. As always, if you're listening in on YouTube, I appreciate a like, a subscribe, or you leaving a comment. I'm continuing to try to bring you great content, and I hope that you enjoy the kind of podcast that I'm bringing to you. Thanks for listening in. I will catch you on the next one.